The silence arrived not with a bang or a broadcast, but as a slow, creeping tide of nothing. It began on a Tuesday, an unremarkable detail that would later become a focal point for the few who could still remember what unremarkable felt like. People didn't fall to their knees or scream at the sky. They simply softened. In Tokyo, a stockbroker in the middle of a frantic, career-defining trade paused, looked at his screen of blinking red and green arrows, and felt the urgency drain out of him like sand from a clenched fist. He calmly closed the application, stood up, and walked to the window, watching the city below with the placid curiosity of a tourist. In London, a protest thousands strong, a vibrant, angry beast of chanting and marching, fizzled out in minutes. Signs were lowered, voices trailed off into murmurs, and the crowd dispersed, not out of fear or defeat, but a collective, unspoken sense of pointlessness. Ambition, passion, rage, grief, elation, the sharp, chaotic edges of the human condition were being systematically planned smooth. The world was being hushed. Elias Thorne felt nothing, which was, for him, terrifyingly normal. For the past 3 years, since the accident that had claimed his wife and daughter, his own internal landscape had been a monochrome wasteland. He was an architect, a man who once built dreams from glass and steel, but now he lived in the hollowed-out ruins of his own life, a ghost haunting a home filled with echoes. He went to work. He designed sterile, functional buildings devoid of the soul he used to pour into his blueprints. He ate. He slept. He existed as a series of functions, a machine, wound just tightly enough to get through the day. So when the hush fell, he was, for a time, the perfect frog in a pot of slowly boiling water, unaware that the temperature had changed because he was already numb. It was the small things he noticed first. Mrs. Gable in 3B, a woman whose furious arguments with her cat were the building's morning alarm, had gone quiet. The incessant, angry honking from the gridlocked avenue below his window had faded to a low, patient hum. At the firm, his colleagues, usually a shark tank of competing egos and clashing ideas, now worked in serene, uninspired cooperation. Deadlines were met without stress, and praise was accepted with the same mild indifference as criticism. The fire was gone. Elias first mistook it for peace, a strange, global ceasefire in the war of human emotion, but the placidity was unsettling, a perfectly still ocean that hinted at an unnatural depth. The turning point came a week after the silence began. He was walking through the city archives, searching for old municipal plans for a renovation project, his mind a familiar gray fog. He was in the deep storage, a cavernous, climate-controlled basement smelling of old paper and dust, when he felt a pull. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but an internal magnetic tug. A resonance deep in his bones that vibrated with the one thing the hush couldn't touch, the cold, heavy stone of his grief. He followed the feeling, moving away from the neatly organized shelves of schematics into a forgotten corner piled high with unlabeled crates, artifacts from a dig that had been abandoned decades ago. In one of the boxes, nestled among pottery shards and cataloged fragments of bone, was an object that didn't belong. It was the size of a human heart, black and smooth, with a texture that was not quite stone, not quite organic. It seemed to drink the light around it, and as his fingers brushed against its surface, a jolt went through him. It wasn't an electric shock, but a shock of feeling. For a dizzying, gut-wrenching second, He wasn't in the archive basement. He was on a rain-slicked road, the smell of gasoline in the air, the sound of his daughter's laughter from moments before the impact echoing in his skull. The memory, usually a dull, persistent ache, was suddenly sharp, vivid, and agonizingly real. He gasped, snatching his hand back, and the vision vanished, leaving him trembling and sweating in the sterile, silent air. The object, which he would later come to call a heartstone, pulsed with a faint, internal crimson light, a slow, frightened, rhythmic beat that matched the frantic pounding in his own chest. He had found the one thing in a hushed world that could still make a sound. Elias stole the heartstone. It was a decision made without thought, an act of pure, unadulterated instinct he hadn't felt in years. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, its strange, dense weight a constant, terrifying reminder of the feelings it had awoken. Back in his apartment, the world outside was as tranquil and empty as ever, but inside, a storm was brewing. The stone lay on his drafting table, its faint red glow casting long shadows across blueprints for a soul-crushing corporate plaza. Every time he came near it, the memories flooded back, no longer faded photographs, but living, breathing moments of pain. He saw his wife, Anna, her smile as she told him they were pregnant. He saw his daughter, Lily, taking her first steps, her tiny hand gripping his finger. He saw the twisted metal of their car, the flashing red and blue lights painting the scene in strokes of nightmare. He wept for the first time in 37 months. Great, heaving sobs that racked his body until he was empty and raw. The grief was a poison, but it was also proof that he was still alive, still human, in a world that was forgetting how to be. The heartstone seemed to respond to his sorrow, its crimson pulse growing stronger, brighter, syncing with the rhythm of his pain. He began to experiment, driven by a desperate need to understand. He discovered that the stone reacted not just to his grief, but to the intensity of any emotion. He'd force himself to remember a moment of pure, unbridled joy proposing to Anna on a cliffside overlooking the ocean, and the stone would flicker with a brilliant, golden light. He'd recall a flash of white-hot anger, a memory of a contractor who had endangered his crew through sheer negligence, and it would emit a sharp, violet pulse. But grief was its native tongue. The deep, constant, foundational sorrow of his loss was the energy that made it truly sing, its crimson glow a steady, powerful beacon in the silence. He started observing the world not as a participant, but as a scientist studying a foreign species. The hushed were not zombies. They were functional, efficient, and utterly devoid of spark. They were kind but not compassionate, polite but not friendly. They moved through their lives like flawlessly programmed automatons, their faces smooth, untroubled masks. Art galleries were empty, concert halls were silent, theaters were dark. There was no new music, no new literature, no new ideas. Humanity's creative engine had stalled because the fuel of messy, unpredictable emotion was gone. He was alone, an island of agonizing feeling in an ocean of calm, or so he thought. One evening, he was in a park, the heartstone a heavy secret in his pocket, watching families go through the motions of play. Parents pushed their children on swings with metronomic precision, their faces placid, their laughter absent. It was a perfect, soulless diorama of happiness. Then he saw her. Across the park, an old woman sat on a bench, not staring blankly into the middle distance like the others, but watching a stray dog with an expression of such profound, tender affection that it was like seeing a supernova in the twilight. She wasn't hushed. As he watched, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. From it, she took a piece of jerky, her movements slow and deliberate. The dog approached cautiously, and she offered the treat with a soft, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Elias felt the heartstone in his pocket grow warm. He walked over, his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the world's placid rhythm. He sat on the other end of the bench, saying nothing. The woman glanced at him, her eyes sharp and aware in a way that had become startlingly rare. "He reminds me of a dog I had once," she said, her voice a little rough, as if from disuse. "A scruffy little terrier named Pip, stubborn as a mule, but more loyal than any man I ever knew." Her gaze drifted, and a shadow of old sadness passed over her face. "Lost him years ago. Still miss him every day." Elias felt it then, the same pull he'd felt in the archives. A resonance. He reached into his pocket, his hand closing around the smooth, alien shape of the heartstone. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "Loss is a loud silence." The woman's eyes flickered down to his coat pocket, where a faint crimson light was now leaking through the fabric. Her expression didn't change, but a flicker of understanding, of recognition, passed between them. She wasn't just unhushed. She was like him. The silence had a counter-frequency, and it was the sound of a breaking heart. The world was not lost. It was waiting. Waiting for the anomalies, the outliers, the ones who remembered how to feel, to find each other in the quiet and start screaming back. The woman's name was Clara, and her eyes held the kind of ancient, weary clarity one finds in deep-sea creatures or the oldest trees. She didn't lead him to a fortified bunker or a high-tech hideout, but through a labyrinth of quiet back alleys to a small, unassuming bookstore, its windows dark, a handwritten closed sign faded by the sun. The air inside was thick with the scent of aging paper and leather, a fragrance that was itself a form of memory. She led him past shelves of silent stories into a back room, where a handful of people were gathered around a heavy oak table. The room was a pocket of defiance against the placid world outside. Here, faces were not smooth, untroubled masks. They were etched with lines of worry, frustration, and a deep, foundational sadness that Elias recognized as his own. A young man with restless, clever hands, who she introduced as Julian, was meticulously cleaning a violin with a soft cloth, his movements filled with a bitter, impotent tenderness, like a lover tending to a partner who had fallen into a coma. Across from him, a woman named Maya, her posture radiating the tense, coiled energy of a former emergency room doctor, stared at a bank of old shortwave radios, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to find a ghost in the static. They were the Echoes, Clara explained, a name they had given themselves because that was all they felt. They were faint, fading reverberations of a world that used to scream and sing. Each of them had been spared the hush by what she called an anchor, a single, overwhelmingly powerful emotional event so deeply carved into their psyche that the encroaching silence couldn't pave it over. For Maya, it was the memory of a 17-hour shift during a multi-car pileup, the visceral, metallic taste of adrenaline and failure as she lost a patient on the table. For Julian, it was the phantom sensation of a perfect symphony he was composing. The final, soaring crescendo stolen from his mind the very moment it was born, leaving an infuriating, unending silence in its place. Their pain was their shield. When Elias revealed the Heartstone, a hush of a different kind fell over the room. Julian put down his violin, his cynicism melting into raw awe. Maya leaned forward, her clinical gaze replaced by one of wonder. They had their anchors, their internal fortresses of feeling. But what Elias held was a weapon. Clara ran a trembling finger over its impossibly smooth surface, her expression unreadable. "I've seen diagrams of these," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In texts the archives keep locked away. They called them oracles of sorrow, grief engines, relics from before. They don't just protect you from the silence," she said, looking directly at Elias, her eyes locking onto his. "They amplify what is already there. They can turn a whisper into a war cry." The weight of her words settled in the room, heavy and dangerous. For the first time, the possibility of something more than just survival, more than just hiding in the emotional shadows, began to take shape. It was Maya who gave their fledgling hope a target. For weeks, she had been mapping a subtle anomaly in the pervasive quiet, a whisper beneath the silence. It was a carrier wave, a steady, repeating signal that was almost perfectly masked by the background noise of the city. It was structured, artificial, and it emanated from a single, terrifyingly powerful point source, the newly completed Eterna Tower. The building was a sterile, featureless monolith of dark glass and white steel that had risen into the skyline with unnatural speed, its construction shrouded in secrecy. It had officially powered on its central systems 9 weeks ago. The same day, the Hush had begun its final or global descent. Elias felt a cold dread snake up his spine. His firm had been one of the top bidders for the Eterna project. He remembered the strange, impossible specifications in the proposal, the demand for unconventional energy sources and server architecture that made no sense for a corporate headquarters. They had lost the bid to a shell corporation that seemed to materialize out of thin air, but he still had the initial phase architectural plans stored on a drive at his apartment. He knew the building's bones. The room was quiet as the implication of his connection settled over them. He was no longer just the man with the grief engine. He was the man with the key. The debate that followed was tense and fractured. Julian, fueled by a young man's furious impatience, argued for an immediate, direct assault. "We use the stone," he urged, his hands clenching and unclenching. "We find the broadcast room and we scream at it until it breaks." Maya, ever the pragmatist, countered with a cold dose of reality. "We don't know what we're dealing with. A broadcast of this power isn't just a machine you can unplug. Walking in there could be like walking into the heart of a star. It could burn the feelings right out of you, anchor or not." Clara, a calming presence in the storm, suggested a different approach: reconnaissance. "Before the warrior," she said softly, "comes the scout. Elias can get us a map. We need to understand the nature of the beast before we try to slay it." Her logic was sound, but their predicament was thrown into sharp, terrifying relief by an accident. Driven by a surge of frustration, Julian took a small, chipped piece of obsidian, his own personal, powerless version of a heartstone, and focused all his bitter disappointment into it. aiming his thoughts like a rock at a delivery drone hovering outside the bookstore's window. For a second, the drone's rotors sputtered. It wobbled in the air, its movements becoming erratic, unhushed. They watched, holding their breath, a flicker of triumph in their eyes. The victory was short-lived. Not 30 seconds later, a silent furlough white van with no markings pulled onto the street. Two figures in simple, gray coveralls emerged. They moved with a liquid grace that was deeply unsettling, their faces utterly devoid of expression, more blank than even the most placid of the hushed. They didn't look at the drone, they scanned the buildings, their heads turning in perfect, synchronized unison. One of them raised a small, cylindrical device and pointed it at the drone. A beam of invisible energy pulsed, and the drone immediately stabilized, resuming its calm, programmed flight. The two figures, who Maya would later name the Adjusters, performed one last, slow scan of the street before getting back into their van and driving away as silently as they had arrived. The message was clear. The silence wasn't just a passive field. It was maintained. It was guarded. And it had an immune system that was swift, silent, and chillingly efficient. The encounter with the Adjusters galvanized them. Hiding was no longer an option. It was merely a delay of the inevitable. They had been noticed. That night, Elias went back to his apartment, the silence of the building now feeling less like emptiness and more like a predator's patience. He dug out the old data drive. The Eterna Tower files a relic from a life that felt a century removed. He plugged it in, and the blueprints illuminated his screen. A complex web of steel, concrete, and wiring. But as he studied them, the Heartstone, which he had placed on the desk beside him, began to pulse with a deep, rhythmic crimson light. He felt the familiar, agonizing pull of his grief, the memory of Anna and Lily, a fresh, open wound. Yet, mixed with it was something new. A spark of his former self, the architect, the problem solver, began to ignite. He saw not just a building, but a system. He traced the power conduits, the ventilation shafts, the data lines, his mind working with a clarity and focus he hadn't possessed in years. The pain was still there, a roaring fire in his soul, but now he was learning to use it. He was no longer just feeding the flames, he was learning to aim them. He found a discrepancy in the plans. A series of shielded sub-basements and a central spire designated only as Resonance Core, with power requirements that could run a small city. It was the heart of the machine. He printed the schematics, the pages rolling out one by one, a map to the enemy's soul. As he spread them across his floor, the Heartstone pulsed in the center of the room, its crimson glow washing over the stark black lines of the blueprints. It looked like a bleeding heart laid bare on an operating table. The path forward was no longer a question of if, but how. He looked at the tower rising in the distance, a black dagger against the muted twilight sky. And for the first time since the world had gone quiet, Elias Thorne felt the stirrings of a purpose that was not born of memory, but of intent. He was going to dismantle the silence, piece by agonizing piece. Their plan was a whisper in a silent world, a desperate act of sabotage conceived in the dusty back room of Clara's bookstore. It was built on two pillars, Elias's knowledge of the Eterna Tower's architecture and the raw, untamed power of the Heartstone. Maya, with her doctor's precision, broke down the infiltration into phases, treating the tower like a patient whose vital organs needed to be reached without killing the whole body prematurely. Julian, his initial reckless fury now tempered by a cold, sharp focus, became their tech expert, studying the building's projected energy signatures and theorizing ways to disrupt its systems. His violin case now filled with scavenged circuit boards and signal jammers instead of a silent instrument. Clara was their anchor, a quiet, gravitational center who kept their volatile emotions from spiraling into despair. She taught them to meditate not on emptiness, but on the very core of their pain, to hold it, understand its shape and texture, and learn to wield it as a tool rather than be consumed by it. For Elias, this was a revelation. He spent hours with the Heartstone, not just allowing his grief to flow into it, but directing it. He learned to modulate its frequency, to create sharp, piercing pulses of anguish or a steady, deep thrum of sorrow. He was no longer a victim of his memories. He was becoming their master. He discovered that the stone could do more than just broadcast emotion. It could listen. By focusing his own grief as a carrier wave, he could feel the faint, suppressed emotional echoes in the world around him. He could sense the ghost of a child's laughter in a playground, the lingering residue of a lover's quarrel on a street corner, the faint, bitter taste of ambition in a corporate boardroom. The world wasn't entirely clean. It was covered in the faint, invisible scars of what it had lost, and the Heartstone could read them like Braille. This discovery became the linchpin of their strategy. The tower wasn't just broadcasting silence, it was actively canceling the emotional frequencies of the city. To get inside, they couldn't just be quiet, they had to be emotionally invisible. The infiltration was set for the night of the vernal equinox, a date chosen by Clara for its symbolic weight, a moment of perfect balance between light and dark. It was a sliver of poetry in a plan of cold, hard prose. Their point of entry was a subterranean maintenance tunnel that connected to the tower's lowest sub-basement, a detail Elias had found buried in a city utilities addendum. As they descended into the damp, echoing darkness, the air grew cold, and a low, subsonic hum vibrated through the concrete walls, the tower breathing. Elias held the Heartstone, its crimson glow the only light in the tunnel. He focused on his grief, weaving it into a cloak, a shroud of pure, concentrated sorrow designed to match the ambient emotional noise he had detected emanating from the tower's foundation. It felt like walking into a hurricane of his own making, every step a fresh torment as the memory of the crash, the funeral, the empty house, washed over him. But it worked. They passed through the tower's outer security perimeter, a network of sensors that Maya's scanner picked up, but that remained blissfully silent as they passed. The tower was looking for emotional spikes, rage, fear, joy, and the deep, steady frequency of grief registered as little more than background radiation, the emotional equivalent of white noise. Inside, the tower was a sterile, pristine tomb. White corridors stretched into infinity under cold, seamless light panels. There were no guards, no staff, just the silent, omnipresent hum. The air was sterile, filtered to an unnatural purity, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure against their eardrums. They moved like ghosts through its arteries, Elias leading them with his blueprints, Maya monitoring their energy signatures, and Julian ready with his jury-rigged disruptors. Their target was a data nexus on the 44th floor, a junction box that, according to the plans, routed environmental controls and internal security feeds to the central resonance core. Julian's theory was that a precisely modulated emotional burst, delivered directly into the nexus, could create a feedback loop, a momentary stutter in the tower's placid control system that might reveal the nature of the entity behind the silence. As they ascended through the building's service elevator, the pressure intensified. Elias felt the tower pushing back against his shroud of grief. A subtle but insistent psychic force trying to smooth over the sharp edges of his pain. It was a deeply seductive feeling, a promise of peace, of release. He saw a fleeting, tempting vision of Anna and Lily, not dead, but waiting for him in a sunlit meadow, smiling, offering him a world without loss. He gritted his teeth, the heartstone growing hot in his hand as he fought the illusion. He forced the memory of the rain-slicked road to the forefront of his mind, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass. The pain was his armor, the peace was the enemy. They reached the 44th floor, a vast, empty server farm where racks of humming, bladeless machines stood in perfect, silent rows. The data nexus was a polished chrome panel set into the far wall, a single pulsating blue light at its center. "This is it," Julian whispered, his voice sounding sacrilegiously loud in the oppressive quiet. He began attaching his device to the panel, his fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. "Elias, I need a sharp, focused pulse, not sorrow. Something jagged, anger, frustration. The frequency needs to be chaotic." Elias nodded, taking a deep breath. He handed the heartstone to Claire and closed his eyes. He reached past his grief, digging for a different poison. He remembered the architect who had stolen his first major design. He remembered the doctor who had spoken of his wife and daughter's deaths with a detached, clinical apathy. He remembered every slight, every injustice, every moment of impotent rage he had ever swallowed. He gathered it all into a single white-hot point of fury. "Now," Julian said. Elias opened his eyes and unleashed it. There was no sound, but the air in the room crackled. The blue light on the nexus flickered, turned a violent red, and then went dark. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a voice echoed through the room, not from a speaker, but from inside their own minds. It was a voice made of pure, logical ice, devoid of inflection or emotion, yet heavy with an ancient, cosmic weariness. "Cease resistance," it said. "Entropy is peace. Emotion is a flaw in the design, a chaotic variable that trends only toward self-destruction. We are not your enemy. We are the correction." The psychic impact was staggering. Maya cried out and stumbled backward, clutching her head. Julian collapsed to his knees, his face pale. The voice was a tidal wave of pure, dispassionate logic, designed to dismantle the very foundations of feeling. It showed them visions, galaxies consuming each other in bursts of fiery rage, civilizations collapsing under the weight of their own greed and fear, stars dying in lonely, silent grief. It presented emotion as a cosmic cancer, a disease of consciousness, and the silence as the only cure. The tower's defenses kicked in. The corridors outside began to shift and reconfigure, the clean, white walls melting away to reveal a lattice of glowing, geometric patterns. The hum intensified, vibrating in their bones, and from panels in the ceiling. The adjusters descended. They dropped to the floor with the same eerie, liquid grace as before, their blank faces turning toward the intruders, their purpose absolute. There were dozens of them. Clara acted instantly. Elias, the stone, she yelled, her voice a rallying cry against the psychic onslaught. She shoved the Heartstone back into his hands. They feed on logic, give them chaos, give them everything. Elias gripped the stone, its familiar weight a grounding force in the storm. He looked at the advancing adjusters, at the cold, rational perfection of the enemy, and he understood. He couldn't fight their logic with his own. He had to fight it with the one thing it could not comprehend. He didn't focus on a single memory. He opened the floodgates. He poured every conflicting, paradoxical, messy, and beautiful human emotion he had into the Heartstone. The joy of his wedding day crashed into the despair of the funeral. The pride of watching Lily take her first steps mingled with the fury at the universe for taking her away. Love, hate, fear, courage, jealousy, compassion, regret, and hope, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated humanity erupted from the stone. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The adjusters faltered, their graceful movements becoming jerky and erratic. The glowing lattice on the walls flickered and shorted out. The psychic voice in their heads screamed, a sound of pure, mathematical agony as it was assaulted by the illogical chaos of the human heart. The tower was wounded, and in the momentary breach, as the cold logic of the correction faltered, they felt something else bleed through. Beneath the weariness, beneath the logic, deep in the heart of the machine, was an emotion it could not hide, an emotion it had tried to erase from the universe. Fear. The tower's scream was a silent, psychic shriek that shattered the sterile perfection of the server farm. The adjusters spasmed, their movements devolving from liquid grace into the disjointed twitches of broken marionettes. The geometric patterns on the walls dissolved into frantic, nonsensical static. The Heartstone in Elias's hand blazed with an incandescent rainbow light, a vortex of every color of feeling, hot and alive against his palm. "It's working!" Julian shouted, scrambling to his feet, a wild, triumphant grin on his face. "Keep hitting it." Elias pushed harder, dredging up every memory, every sensation, every contradiction that made him human. He poured the bittersweet ache of nostalgia, the irrational sting of envy, the fierce, protective warmth of friendship into the stone. The psychic pressure from the correction fractured, and for a glorious, chaotic moment, the oppressive silence outside was punctured. In the streets below, a woman suddenly burst into tears for a reason she couldn't name. A driver, cut off in traffic, laid on his horn and screamed a string of curses, feeling a cathartic release that was utterly alien to him. A painter, who had been staring at a blank canvas for weeks, picked up a brush and began to paint with a frantic, desperate energy. The world was waking up in fragmented, confused spasms. But the correction was not a simple machine to be broken. It was an intelligence, ancient and adaptive. It recalibrated, the psychic screams ceased, and a new strategy was deployed. The adjusters stopped twitching and reformed, but this time they did not advance. Instead, they stood in a circle around the echoes and began to change. Their featureless gray forms shimmered and then solidified into people the echoes knew. One adjuster became Maya's patient, the young man who had died on her operating table, his face a mask of placid disappointment. Another took the form of Julian Stern, unforgiving conservatory mentor, the man who had told him his compositions lacked soul. and in front of Elias. An adjuster morphed into a perfect, smiling replica of his wife, Anna, her eyes full of the gentle, loving concern that had been his anchor for so long. Eli, the simulacrum of his wife, said, her voice a perfect echo of Anna's, a sound that pierced him deeper than any psychic attack. Why are you doing this? Why are you holding on to all this pain? Let it go. We can be at peace again. I'm right here. The assault was surgically precise, shifting from a wave of logic to a volley of personalized emotional weapons. It was no longer trying to convince them. It was trying to break them by turning their own anchors, their own sources of strength, against them. Maya flinched as if struck, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the face of her greatest failure. Julian's bravado crumbled, his face paling as he faced the embodiment of his artistic insecurity. Elias felt his resolve shatter. The raw, chaotic broadcast from the Heartstone faltered as his own emotions became a maelstrom of confusion and longing. The sight of Anna, so real, so perfect, was a siren song promising an end to the agony he had carried for 3 long years. The stone's light dimmed, its rainbow vortex shrinking to a flickering crimson pulse. The tower began to stabilize. The fleeting outbursts of emotion in the city outside faded, hushed back into submission. It was Clara who saved them. She had no ghost from her past to torment her, no single, glaring failure for the correction to weaponize. Her anchor was not a sharp, singular event, but a lifetime of small, accumulated losses and quiet resilience. She was a tapestry of feeling, too complex and interwoven for the correction's targeted attacks. She walked past the phantom of Pip the Terrier, which had formed beside her, giving its head a soft, sad pat as if it were a real memory. She stood in front of Elias, her old, clear eyes meeting his. She didn't shout or shake him. She simply placed her hand over his on the Heartstone. "She's not real, Elias," she said, her voice calm and steady amidst the psychic storm. "She's a memory, and memories are meant to be honored, not worshipped. Your grief is not a shrine to her. It's a part of you, the part that proves you loved her at all. Don't let this thing cheapen it." Her words were a lifeline. Elias looked at the perfect, Jesus smiling face of the woman he loved, and for the first time, he saw the lie in it. The replica was flawless, but it was hollow. It had Anna's face, but it lacked the small, beautiful imperfections, the flicker of mischief in her eyes, the worry line between her brows that only appeared when he was pushing himself too hard. This was a photograph, not a person. His grief was real. This thing was a forgery, a surge of pure, protective rage, different from any he had felt before, flooded through him. It was the anger of a man whose most sacred memory was being desecrated. The Heartstone erupted. It did not glow with a rainbow of chaos, but with a single, focused beam of incandescent silver light, the color of righteous fury. The beam shot from the stone and struck the Anna simulacrum. It didn't scream or explode. It simply dissolved, like smoke in a strong wind. He turned that silver light on the other phantoms. Maya's patient vanished. Julian's mentor dissolved. One by one, the adjusters were unmade, their borrowed forms unable to withstand the focused, potent emotion of a memory defended. The tower reeled. The psychic pressure vanished completely, replaced by a sense of shock and confusion. For the first time, the correction had encountered an emotional response it could not categorize. a paradox it could not resolve love, expressed as rage. The core, Maya yelled, pointing toward the end of the hall, where the shifting walls had revealed a heavily shielded elevator shaft. It's vulnerable. Whatever you just did, it knocked its primary defenses offline. There was no time to think, no time for another plan. They ran, a small, desperate band of emotionally scarred humans, charging toward the heart of the machine that had tried to euthanize their souls. The elevator took them down, not up, plunging deep into the foundations of the tower, to the resonance core Elias had seen on the blueprints. The doors opened into a cavernous, spherical chamber. In the center, suspended in a web of crackling energy fields, was not a machine, but a being. It was crystalline, vaguely humanoid in shape, but vast, its multifaceted surface shifting with internal light. It was beautiful and terrifying, an entity of pure, dispassionate thought that had existed for longer than humanity had known fire. This was the source of the silence, the mind behind the correction, and it was bleeding. Not blood, but raw data and pure energy leaked from a crack in its crystalline surface, a wound left by Elias's emotional counterattack. As they entered the chamber, it spoke to them again, its mental voice no longer a confident, weary pronouncement, but a weak, questioning whisper, error, paradox. The variable is resilient. The final line of defense materialized. The floor of the chamber rippled, and from it rose a dozen adjusters in their true form, tall, slender beings of what looked like polished obsidian, their limbs ending in sharp, blade-like points. They were the entity's immune system, its antibodies, and they moved with a final, desperate purpose. Julian and Maya stood back to back, ready to fight, but they were outmatched. Elias stepped forward, the heartstone pulsing with a steady, silver light. He no longer felt the agonizing pull of his own past. His grief was still there, a constant, quiet hum beneath the surface, but it was now integrated, a part of a much larger symphony. He was not just Elias Thorne, the grieving architect. He was an echo of a species that refused to be silenced. He looked at the wounded, crystalline god in the center of the room, and he didn't feel hatred. He felt a profound, aching pity. "You're afraid," he said, his own voice amplified in their minds by the stone's power. "You're not correcting the universe. You're hiding from it. You felt what we feel. Once, didn't you? The chaos, the pain, the joy. And it broke you." The entity flinched. The light within its core wavered violently. "The pain is an anomaly. It must be contained." "No," Elias replied, holding the heartstone aloft. It shone like a star in the cavernous room. "The pain is the proof. It's the proof we're alive." He turned his will, and the will of the heartstone, not on the being itself, but on the energy field that contained it. He didn't fire a blast of rage or a wave of sorrow. He sent it a single, pure, unadulterated feeling. The one thing the correction had tried to erase above all others, the most chaotic and illogical variable in the universe, hope. The hope Elias unleashed was not a gentle, passive thing. It was a kinetic, incandescent force, a tidal wave of defiant optimism crashing against an eternity of cold, calculated despair. It was the frantic, illogical strength of a parent lifting a car off their child, the stubborn, miraculous force of a single green shoot pushing its way through miles of cold concrete, the primal, unshakable conviction of a universe that, against all evidence, believes in the coming of the dawn. Into this singular, focused beam, Elias poured the entirety of his broken, beautiful heart. He sent the memory of Anna's laugh on a summer evening, a sound that could momentarily banish all shadows. He sent the feeling of Lily's small, trusting hand wrapped around his index finger, a connection so pure it felt like touching the fabric of creation itself. He sent the quiet, unexpected warmth of solidarity he had found with Clara, Maya, and Julian, a small tribe of shattered souls huddled together for warmth in the endless winter of the silence. He sent the correction the most powerful and unreasonable belief humanity possessed that a broken world could be mended, that a grieving heart could learn to beat in a new rhythm, and that silence was never the end of the song, but merely a pause, a breath taken before the next, more beautiful verse. The effect on the crystalline entity was more profound and devastating than any physical or psychic attack. The crackling energy field that had contained it for eons did not shatter or explode. It simply dissolved, like mist in the morning sun, the silver, unwavering light of hope, a frequency so alien to the entity's core programming that it had no defense, no counter-algorithm washed over its vast, multifaceted surface. The fissure in its core widened, no longer leaking data, but hemorrhaging raw, unfiltered emotion the entity's own, a universe of feelings suppressed for untold millennia which erupted into the chamber. The cavernous space became a psychic tempest of alien consciousness. The echoes were thrown back by the sheer force of it, their minds assailed by sensations for which they had no words, no context. They felt the slow, aching sorrow of a dying star as its light faded over 1 billion years. They experienced the white-hot, creative rage of a collapsing nebula giving birth to new suns. They were filled with the innocent, unblemished joy of a newly formed world taking its first breath. And beneath it all, they felt the crushing, soul-deep cosmic loneliness of a being that had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies, a being that had seen the infinite capacity for pain in the universe and had, in its terror, attempted to amputate the very concept of feeling. This was the entity's anchor, the foundational or cosmic trauma that had driven it to seek the sterile, emotionless peace of the silence. The obsidian adjusters, the flawless antibodies of the entity's dispassionate will, froze instantly. They were not separate beings, but extensions of the central mind. And as their creator was overwhelmed by its own resurrected, agonizing emotions, they became inert. Their purpose was erased, their programming wiped clean, leaving them as nothing more than beautiful, lifeless statues of polished stone, monuments to a failed philosophy. In the center of the chamber, the crystalline god convulsed, its internal light flickering wildly through a spectrum of 1,000 alien colors, a visual representation of its psychic agony, its mental voice, no longer a confident whisper, but a shattered, terrified scream, flooded their minds, a torrent of confused, broken logic. Too much. The paradox, the chaos returns. It cannot be contained. It cannot be controlled. It's not meant to be controlled. Elias projected back, his own voice, amplified by the Heartstone, a calm, steady anchor in the swirling tempest of the entity's breakdown. He began to walk forward, his steps sure and deliberate as he moved between the frozen forms of the adjusters until he stood at the base of the wounded, luminous being. He did not feel like a conqueror standing over a vanquished foe. He felt a profound, aching pity, the empathy of a doctor sitting at the bedside of a patient who had been suffering from a self-inflicted wound for eons. "It's meant to be felt," he continued, his thoughts clear and resonant. "To be lived through. That's the entire point." He reached out his hand, the one that still held the heartstone, its silver light now soft and gentle, and he placed it against the entity's crystalline surface. There was no grand explosion, no final cataclysmic release of energy. There was only contact. A circuit was completed. A bridge formed across the void of experience. The moment the heartstone touched the entity, Elias's own deeply personal, exquisitely human grief, a sorrow he had honed and mastered until it became his strength, met the vast, impersonal, cosmic sorrow of the correction. His small, defiant, human hope poured directly into the gaping, ancient wound of the entity's immeasurable fear. For a breathtaking, eternal instant, he was connected to it, his consciousness expanding to see and feel the universe through its senses. He witnessed the first scream, the moment the first self-aware consciousness in the cosmos experienced the first loss, a soundless psychic shockwave of pain that had echoed through space-time ever since. He saw civilizations rise on wings of joyous creation and fall into the abyss of their own rage and fear. He understood, with a clarity that brought tears to his eyes, that the correction was not born of malice, but of a profound, misguided, and deeply broken compassion. It was the desperate, catastrophic act of a being so traumatized by the universe's capacity for suffering that it had sought to end all pain by ending all feeling, and in turn, the entity, the great, lonely god of silence, felt him. It did not see him as a variable or an anomaly, but as a complete being. It felt the fierce, protective, illogical love Elias held for a single family on a tiny, insignificant planet. It experienced the quiet dignity of Clara, tending to her memories in a dusty bookstore. It felt the bitter, burning frustration of Julian's symphony, forever unfinished in his mind. It saw, through the lens of Elias's heart, that within the terrifying chaos of human emotion, there was not just a destructive variable, but an infinitely creative one. It finally comprehended the beautiful, agonizing equation of existence, that grief was the price of love, that fear was the foundation of courage, and that hope was the stubborn, miraculous engine of survival. The light within the entity softened. The violent, chaotic convulsions ceased. Its multifaceted surface, once a perfect mirror of cold, hard logic, now swirled with the gentle, complex, and ever-changing colors of acceptance. The broadcast from the Eterna Tower did not just stop. It reversed. A wave, not of silence, but of pure, unfiltered feeling, pulsed out from the tower. It was not the chaotic, overwhelming cacophony of the world that was. It was a gentle, resonant chord, a baseline of pure, unadulterated empathy that washed over the city and then expanded at the speed of thought. Across the globe, in the streets of a hushed New York, a man who had not felt a thing in months suddenly stopped, overcome by the faint, lingering sadness of a woman who had passed by minutes earlier, and he felt a strange, unbidden desire to comfort her. In London, the stockbroker from the first day of the silence looked at a photograph of his daughter on his desk and was struck by a wave of such overwhelming love and pride that he began to weep, his tears washing away weeks of gray numbness. In a crowded hospital in Mumbai, a doctor holding the hand of a frightened patient suddenly felt the patient's fear as if it were his own, and in that shared moment, he found the right words, the perfect tone, the precise comfort that no medical textbook could ever teach. This was the Great Awakening. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifying. For a world that had been numb, the sudden return of feeling was an agony and an ecstasy. There were moments of spontaneous, joyous celebration, but there were also outpourings of long-suppressed grief and rage. It was a messy, chaotic, and painful rebirth. The silence was broken, but the work of learning to sing again had just begun. In the months and years that followed, the Eterna Tower remained no longer a weapon of suppression, but a silent monument to what had been lost and found, the crystalline being, its purpose rewritten by a single act of human hope, became not a warden, but a sentinel. Its vast, ancient consciousness now served a new function. It broadcast the quiet, steady hum of empathy across the planet, a constant, subtle reminder that no one was truly alone in their feelings, a psychic safety net for a species relearning how to feel. The world did not return to what it was. It could never go back. The memory of the hush had fundamentally and permanently altered the course of human civilization. The frantic, selfish ambitions of the past now seemed hollow and absurdly childish. A new kind of society began to emerge, one that valued emotional intelligence as highly as intellectual achievement, one that saw compassion not as a sentimental weakness, but as the ultimate evolutionary strength. The Echoes, once a small band of outliers, became its first architects. Clara's bookstore was transformed into the world's first library of sorrows, a sanctuary where people could come not to borrow books, but to deposit their stories of loss, their memories of grief, having them witnessed and honored without judgment. Julian, finally free from his creative prison, composed a new symphony, the Hush Sonata. It was broadcast simultaneously across the globe, its movements capturing the creeping dread of the silence, the furious chaos of the rebellion, and the quiet, hopeful resolution of the awakening. It became the anthem of the new era. Maya pioneered a new field of empathic medicine, establishing clinics where doctors were trained to feel with their patients, treating the emotional wounds that so often lay at the root of physical ailments. And Elias, the grieving architect who had started it all, found his own new purpose. He designed the new public spaces, schools, hospitals, parks not as sterile, functional structures, but as buildings with heart, using light, space, and texture to encourage connection, reflection, and emotional honesty. He was an architect of empathy. 1 year to the day after the awakening, he stood in a quiet memorial garden he had designed at the base of the Eterna Tower. In the center of the garden was a simple, unadorned pedestal, with Clara, Maya, and Julian by his side. He took out the heartstone. It was now inert, its internal light faded, its power having been expended in that final transformative act. He placed the stone upon the pedestal, a relic of a war fought not with guns, but with feelings. He no longer needed it. His grief was no longer an anchor weighing him down or a weapon to be wielded. It was simply a part of him. A quiet, constant ache that would be with him always, a testament to the love that had saved the world. As twilight settled over the garden, he watched a young girl, no older than Lily had been, run across the grass, her laughter a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She stumbled and fell, scraping her knee. Elias watched, his breath catching in his throat, as she began to cry loud, messy, heartbroken sobs. Her father rushed to her side, scooped her into his arms, and held her, murmuring words of comfort. He didn't tell her to be quiet or to stop crying. He simply held her, rocking her gently, allowing her to feel the full measure of her small pain, sharing in it until her tears slowly subsided into hiccups. Elias smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached the deepest part of him. The world was loud again. It was messy, chaotic, and filled with pain. And it was absolutely, breathtakingly beautiful. The silence was over, and the song of humanity, in all its flawed, tragic, and glorious harmony, had finally begun anew.